From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It feels like a long time ago already, but 2026 began with a bang.
Last night, on the order of the President of the United States, and in support of a request from the Department of Justice, the United States military conducted an apprehension mission in Caracas, Venezuela, to bring to justice two indicted persons, Nicolas and Cecilia Maduro.
Venezuelans woke up to the news that Donald Trump was now in charge.
So we are going to run the country until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition.
So what does that actually mean? What does America running the country actually look like?
Well, this is a street in the heart of Caracas, just over a month since President Maduro was captured. So what's changed?
That's Stephen Gibbs, our man in Venezuela. He's been based in the region for over 20 years and covers Latin America, the Caribbean, and increasingly, President Trump's imperial ambitions for the Times and the Sunday Times.
Just in the first few days after that capture, these streets and most of the city were completely empty. People were frightened. There were these colectivos around. These are armed sort of pro-government gangs. So people were just staying at home, just nipping out to get their essential supplies. But a few weeks on, all that has changed. And now a degree of normality has returned. You know, in this shop I'm looking at right now, a few weeks ago, one or two customers, but now you can see a queue of people just going in and buying whatever they need as per normal.
So what is happening in Venezuela? What's America doing with its millions of barrels of oil? And how has it led to a humanitarian crisis in Cuba? And will that be President Trump's next target? The story today: drugs, oil and power. What Trump's doing with Venezuela. Stephen, take us back to the start of this year, really. Where were you? And just describe how things played out.
Well, on January the 3rd, I was in Venezuela, but not in Caracas. I was on Isla Margarita, one of Venezuela's Caribbean islands, where the mood really was, is this country ever going to change? You know, we knew that there was this US naval flotilla out in the Caribbean, actually quite near Isla Margarita. There had been attacks on some drug boats, but there was a bit of a sense of a sort of impasse and a feeling that would Trump make a move on Venezuela? Would he not? And then, lo and behold, in the early hours of January the 3rd, I was woken by friends in Caracas who called me. I was in, as I say, in Isla Margarita, and they said there was the sound of helicopters. It wasn't quite clear what was happening, whether perhaps this was an internal coup. One diplomat I know was woken up and he thought perhaps that sound was fireworks. He noticed that his dog, who is very, very scared of fireworks, seemed completely unafraid. And that was his signal that this was something different. There were only 3 major explosions, but for a country that's never been invaded, it was a real shock. And there were people who were extremely worried and wondering, you know, what was happening. But it soon became apparent that this was a US operation. And then there was this sort of next day feeling of, oh my God, this is what a lot of Venezuelans actually had been hoping for. But the change that they thought would accompany that moment, because the assumption would be there would be full regime change, that didn't transpire.
And Steve, the next day, when they realised this wasn't the moment when democracy was about to arrive in Venezuela, the opposition weren't suddenly going to get a look in. Instead, Donald Trump announced that he was now running the country. What did that mean? What's changed?
pretty quickly people realized that when Trump said that, that's just Trump saying it. There was no evidence at all that the United States was suddenly running a large country in South America. There aren't any American forces in Venezuela. It's the same people, the same vice president, the same minister of defense, the same interior minister as there was before January the 3rd. He's trying to portray what's happened as a sort of mission accomplished to a certain extent.
Stephen, to understand the state that Venezuela was in before this invasion, I suppose just give us a very quick potted history of what's been happening in the country.
Venezuela is blessed or cursed, depending on which way you want to look at it, with having the world's largest proven oil reserves, which were first discovered in the 1920s. Its recent history has been something of a troublemaker in South America, certainly from the United States point of view. In 1999, a former paratrooper, Hugo Chavez, was elected president. He previously had tried to take power via a coup.
Sitting on top of it all is the charismatic, autocratic president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, whose recent life resembles a South American soap opera.
Here's the way you're perceived in the United States by some people. Sort of a mixture between Fidel Castro and Juan Perón. Power-hungry, left-wing demagogue. Dictator.
Se me ha comparado con Hitler.
I have been compared to Hitler, a sort of mix between Mussolini and who knows, the devil himself.
Diablo.
And what I do is struggle for a people. I am a true Democrat.
Verdadero demócrata soy.
And his rule coincided, fortunately for him, with a boom in the global oil price. So suddenly he had the opportunity of an absolute flood of oil money to spend it on populist projects. He set up small health clinics in some of the poorest areas of Venezuela. He built homes and gave them for free to hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans. Many Venezuelans who'd never elected before, he got them on the electoral register and became something of an icon for the left in Latin America. During that period, and probably because he was popular, one of the things he started to do was sort of undermine some of the institutions in Venezuela. He politicized things like the Supreme Court, the army, even the group that is running Venezuelan elections. People sort of didn't care so much because he was still probably the most popular leader in the country. But that undermining of the institutions became important when he was taken ill, and he eventually died in 2013. Before he died, nominated Nicolas Maduro as his successor. And then the oil price started to go down. Nicolas Maduro was nothing like Hugo Chavez. There were many attempts to vote him out of power, but he was fortunate because he had all those institutions that were really under the control of the government. So they could fiddle things as much as they needed to, really, to remain in power. And that, sort of simply put, is what happened. There were elections in 2018 and 2024, most notoriously in 2024, where all the evidence really is that the government lost it, that President Maduro was not re-elected as president, but his tame electoral council was able to declare victory despite that evidence.
Scenes of violence across Caracas, one person dying when security forces tried to break up protests triggered by Sunday's hotly disputed election results.
It's a fraud. There was a lot of discontent towards the government. The majority of people were voting for change.
So, Stephen, that's the backdrop of Venezuela and the problems it had got into before Donald Trump's extraordinary operation at the start of this year. When that happened, how did he justify it? What were his reasons for going into Venezuela?
The whole operation before it happened was largely framed as an anti-drug operation. The United States had said that President Maduro was a narco-terrorist. They had begun attacking small speedboats that were, some of them leaving Venezuela, and saying kind of implausibly that some of them were bringing fentanyl or cocaine from Venezuela to the United States. The United States is obviously by sea a very, very long way from from Venezuela. And actually, most of the drug trafficking from Venezuela is going to other Caribbean islands and onward, and mostly to Europe. But this was how it was framed, that the country had been sort of hijacked by a drug cartel, and that to stop it, we needed to ideally get rid of President Maduro, and we needed to completely sort of end the control of that cartel of the country. He also said other stuff. He said that Venezuela had emptied its prisons and sent millions of migrants to the United States. Again, a somewhat distortion of what really happened. Many, many millions of people did leave Venezuela because of the crisis here. This is a country that's experienced inflation well over 1,000,000%, but only a very small proportion of them had been in prison.
And one of the surprising things about Donald Trump's statements around Venezuela was, a lot of commentators thought he was kind of saying the quiet part out loud when he started talking about oil.
Trump made some outrageous comments about oil, including he said that Venezuela had stolen the oil from the United States. Difficult one to justify. Obviously, the Venezuelan oil is Venezuelan. What he was referring to really is two periods in Venezuelan history. One in 1976, when the Venezuelan oil industry was nationalized. That caused some minor friction with some of the US oil companies that were operating then. But actually, the US oil industry very much stayed in Venezuela. But then in the early 2000s, under Chavez, the hydrocarbon law was changed in 2001, making it much more generous to the state and much less generous to the foreign oil companies. And several of them, including Exxon, left. And then there were legal battles about how much each side should be compensated, etc. So he was feeling that the United States oil industry had been hard done by Venezuela, and it was now time to get its own back.
Well, it's been more than a month. Donald Trump, as he said, is officially in charge. It's fascinating to see what's actually changed, because the news has moved at such a dizzying pace. We haven't really looked back at Venezuela since then. You mentioned that the vice president was now in charge, Delcy Rodriguez. Tell us a bit about her. What's her background?
Delcy Rodriguez is really a part of a sort of brother-sister power couple that have been very dominant in Venezuelan politics for many years. She was Maduro's vice president since 2018. Her brother Jorge Rodriguez is currently the head of the National Assembly, the sort of parliament here. They are the children of another Jorge Rodriguez, who was a sort of revolutionary activist in the 1970s. But actually, she's also very pragmatic. She's seen as one of the more cosmopolitan of the people in the upper echelons of the regime. She spent some of her education was outside the country. She was at the Sorbonne in Paris for some of her studies. She also studied in London. She worked in the Venezuelan embassy in London. So she speaks good French. You see her at diplomatic events and she's speaking fluent French to some of the African delegations there. She speaks perfectly reasonable English. She has something of a taste for fashion, which she's perfectly open about. So she's not your sort of classic old school revolutionary at all. And I've met her actually once, and people I know who've dealt with her and had to work with her in the oil industry, etc., say that despite this sort of kind of revolutionary rhetoric, behind an office desk trying to sign a contract, this is a very, very capable person who gets things done, which has been a bit of a rarity in this country. And I think that message got through to the Americans as they were searching around thinking, well, if we take Maduro out, who's going to replace her? There was quite a sort of short list. And Delcy Rodriguez was considered the person they could do business with.
How popular is she now in Venezuela?
There have actually been a couple of polls, one by The Economist, one by Bloomberg, suggesting that Delcy Rodriguez is not popular. She has sort of around 10% support. Now, that might have changed a little bit since those polls came out, because there are signs of improvement here. But no, she's never been elected. She's seen as part of the old guard.
I mean, there were rumours at the time about how much she might have known that America was about to arrive and take Maduro. Do we know any more about that?
The person who clearly has arguably benefited the most is Delcy Rodriguez. And the sort of smoothness of the transition certainly raised a few eyebrows. Politically, it didn't seem like a country in trauma in the days and hours just after Maduro was taken away. You would have thought the whole sort of thing would freeze, but actually within really a day or two, the cabinet was meeting, everything was going on as normal. So that made people think, wait a sec, did she know about this in advance? Now, there's no evidence at all of that. I think what we can say is that a plan was prepared either for Maduro being out of the picture, or perhaps there's another theory that if the 2024 election had been deemed fair, then the government would be doing a whole lot of things that it is doing now. So it sort of had a blueprint ready, which it put in place in these rather extraordinary circumstances.
I mean, it is amazing how quickly that transition has happened. How has her relationship with America played out, and how does that affect the way the Venezuelans see her? I mean, that's a very difficult line to balance.
Yes, she's in a really awkward position, to put it mildly, and the way she seems to be handling it is giving two different messages to two different audiences. When she's giving a speech to local people here, for example, she was down in one of the oil-producing areas just a few days ago. There she gives a speech saying, we're never going to succumb to any American bullying. Our oil industry is ours. There's only one person who runs this country, and that is me and the people of Venezuela.
In the face of adversities, in the face of coup d'etat, in the face of oil sabotages, we are ready to defend Venezuela. We are ready to defend our natural resources that must be for national development. The extremists who have promoted this armed aggression against our country, history and justice will make them pay.
But it appears that in her private phone calls, which we understand that she's speaking 3 times a week to Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State of the United States, it's a different message, and they are not unhappy with her. President Trump said that she's terrific, to use his word. And to a certain extent, she wants to cooperate with the Americans, because what we're seeing is this sort of lifting of US sanctions, which is beneficial for the government and the country. So she's happy about that, but she has to be careful about not being seen as sort of President Trump's sort of local governor or anything.
Is there any sign, though, of there being elections? Will there be a democratic process somewhere in this? And what's happened to the opposition in the meantime? Because they, as you say, welcomed Donald Trump intervening, and it hasn't worked out so well.
The new regime, if we want to call it that, they are certainly giving signals that they want to turn the page. They have started releasing political prisoners. There were about 1,000 in jail. Around 400 have been released. Now, the Americans and some elements of the opposition will say patience is what matters now, and what's going to happen is the economy is going to stabilize, and then we will go towards a sort of transition process and eventually an election. Some people in the US government say between 18 months and 24 months. Some of the opposition activists who've been released from jail have begun to sort of speak out a little bit more openly. There's a bit of a lifting of the feeling of fear, but we've also seen people being released and then being re-arrested. So it's a very delicate balance.
Yeah, there is some democratic loosening. And it's interesting that it's not just Delcy Rodriguez who seems to understand the importance of building relationships with America in order to be able to do well in Venezuela. Tell us a bit about how the opposition is managing that.
Well, the opposition leader in many ways is Maria Corina Machado. She's a former congresswoman. She wanted to stand for the presidency in 2024. She was ruled that she couldn't do that by the regime. Evidence, she would say, of just how undemocratic this is. She put in a stand-in. She then organized the whole opposition campaign. And her stand-in, Edmundo Gonzalez, it appears he won the election in 2024. But another result was declared. Then she was persecuted. She had to go into hiding. She then won the Nobel Peace Prize. And then she's had to manage this very complicated relationship with President Trump. So one of the things, of course, she did when she met him was she shared, she said, her Nobel Peace Prize with him, which he gladly recede.
Well, she offered it to me. I thought it was very nice. She said, you know, you've ended 8 wars, and nobody deserves this prize more than in history than you do. And I thought it was a very nice gesture. And by the way, I think she's a very fine woman, and we'll be talking again.
Now, she is in a difficult position because she's sort of put all her cards with Trump. She probably hoped, and perhaps still hopes, that he is going to help ensure she can eventually be president. But the signs are that for the time being, there's been a decision in the United States that she really wasn't the right person for the job immediately. And the reason is that this is a country, as we've said, where the institutions are very much controlled by the regime. The idea of putting an opposition leader who might well be the most popular person in the country, but doesn't have the kind of trust of the people that really matter, the army, the military, that could cause the sort of genesis of a civil war. So this sort of fudge solution was keep the same people in, let them try and democratize the country, and then when you feel sort of safe enough to move to the next stage, then you can have elections and then you can possibly have a big transition. Now, it's a bit of a risk because if the guys in power try and stretch out the timing of it, there's the big question of how much does the Trump administration really care about that? If they're getting their hands on the oil, do they really need a democracy as well?
Stephen, you've been telling us how much has changed in Venezuela and how much hasn't since Donald Trump effectively took it over. One of the unintended consequences, perhaps, has been on some of the countries that have been dependent on it. Tell us a little bit about the situation at the moment in Cuba.
Yes, I mean, there is an argument that perhaps this was the intended plan, that if the Trump administration has decided that it just doesn't want any anti-American regimes or governments in the Americas, then it's sort of, because they're all connected, you pick one off and then the next one gets weak. And that's certainly what we've been seeing in relation to Cuba. Cuba needs oil, and that's part of the very close relationship it's had with Venezuela, which began under Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez. There was this sort of deal where Cuba would send doctors and nurses to Venezuela, and Venezuela would send highly subsidized oil. Now, since Trump has began to supervise effectively the whole Venezuelan oil industry, that tap has been switched off. So Cuba is suddenly not getting any oil at all from Venezuela. Concurrently, Trump has also threatened tariffs on anyone else that sends oil to Cuba. So it's very much feeling the pressure. You're suddenly seeing this very close relationship begin to fall apart. People in Havana are describing it as like a ghost town, that suddenly, because there's no fuel, no one can move around. Electricity, also powered historically by Venezuelan oil, it's more often off than on. And there's a big question mark of if Trump is attempting to do the same in Cuba, whether he can imitate the operation in Venezuela and Cuba. The answer is it would appear to be a whole lot more complicated because you don't have an opposition waiting in the wings. You don't have anyone like the vice president who could just sort of take over and do what the Americans say. And there is a risk that, maybe the Trump administration thinks we can do them all now, and they may find the next few are going to be a lot more difficult.
And in terms of the oil, the taps that have turned off to Cuba, we know America is now overseeing it. What has that actually meant? What's happening to Venezuela's oil?
Well, just in the build-up to this, one of the real pressures on the Maduro government was that the United States started sanctioning the shadow fleet, these ships that switch off their transponders and therefore evade US sanctions. So the United States started seizing some of the ships, and as a result, Venezuela suddenly found it couldn't export any of its oil. And that is a total crisis for any oil-producing nation, not just in terms of its economy, but also logistically. You really can't switch off the oil pumps particularly easily without causing very serious damage that will take years to sort out. So Venezuela had nowhere to put its oil. It was storing it on tanks, on land, on tankers, offshore. Up to about 50 million barrels of oil was sort of stuck. Now, when this operation was done to remove Maduro, Trump said, right, what are we going to do with that 50 million barrels of oil? What they have done is come to an arrangement with Venezuela to buy that oil. The United States government is to a certain extent brokering it, selling it on to other traders and paying Venezuela back via a rather complicated system via Qatar and an offshore fund there. But the end result has been that $500 million has now arrived in a Venezuelan central bank account, which, again, the United States says, right, we're going to supervise how that's spent to make sure there's no corruption, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very odd deal, but because of the sort of previous situation where Venezuela was having to sort of sell its oil, trying to bypass sanctions, which in short means you sell it at a huge discount. Now that that same oil is being sold to arguably the aggressor, the United States, the country that Venezuela blames for a lot of its problems, not without reason, it's actually getting a whole lot more money for each barrel of oil. So you are seeing a degree of stability here, and it's very difficult to sort of measure that in these early days. But one thing we noticed quite quickly was that currency was sinking out of control. It had lost sort of 25% of its value in a spate of a few days. That has now stabilized to a certain extent, and the reason would appear to be because those dollars are coming in via this rather odd American deal.
So that does sound like a benefit to Venezuela and its economy. The money is coming in. It's not as bad as it sounded when Donald Trump said they were taking the oil. But if $500 million have gone into Venezuela, do we know how much is going into America? How much are they making out of this?
Trump would certainly spin it as a good deal for everyone. There's no question that some of these traders are doing well from this oil, but I don't think disproportionately so.
And what about oil extraction in the future? Do we know what's happening about that?
One of the things we've seen is in Venezuela is some degree of undoing of the situation before, where the legal framework here was very favorable to the government. So international oil firms felt it was really difficult to invest here because very high royalties needed to be paid to the government. Any arbitration issue had to be settled in Venezuela, where they doubted whether that would be fair. Now that's all been changed very, very quickly in the last few weeks. The hydrocarbon law of Venezuela has been rewritten and passed and gone through Parliament. And executives now say that the deal on offer is actually as generous as you can possibly get, really, to foreign firms. Then swiftly after that was passed, the US sort of in tango began to move to lift sanctions, its own sanctions, so that United States oil companies can begin to operate here and trade with PDVSA, the state oil company. Trump actually had a meeting in the White House, including representatives from some of the biggest oil firms.
Well, it's a great honor to be with among the biggest companies in the world, and we're doing tremendous things. Our country is doing very well.
Trump is, of course, spinning this as, suddenly we have access to the world's biggest oil fields. Venezuela is going to be the new Dubai, etc.
But it's tremendous reserves, among the biggest in the world. Some people say it is the biggest in the world. And we're going to be working with Venezuela. We're going to be making the decision as to which oil companies are going to go in, that we're going to allow to go in.
That's how he's attempted to sell this. Some seemed enthusiastic, but quite a few seem to view the Trump plan with a degree of caution, and they're a bit reluctant to go all in again just on the promise from Trump that everything's going swimmingly down in Venezuela. But the truth is that it will need an enormous amount of investment to get the Venezuelan oil industry on its feet again.
So, Stephen, that's the oil. The main reasons Donald Trump said he was going into Venezuela, though, were drugs and migrants officially. Has anything changed on that score?
Yes, well, funnily enough, no one talks about drugs anymore. And, the idea that would stop just because a president is removed is obviously somewhat implausible. I think it reveals that the whole story of the drugs was a bit of a cover.
And what about Maduro? Do we know what's happened to him?
He's in New York, in jail, awaiting trial. What we're hearing from Venezuela is he really, really didn't expect this. Just before all this happening, he was dancing, saying, "Come and get me if you want to." Literally dancing to a remix of some words he'd said. He'd said, "I want peace, not war." He doesn't pronounce peace correctly. He celebrated his very, very limited ability with the English language. And that may have been a big mistake. There's certainly one report that Trump saw him dancing and thought, this guy's not taking me or the United States seriously, and it's time to press the green button and remove him. There is some speculation that maybe he himself might be part of some sort of deal, but you slightly wonder if he ever did come back, whether there'd be any sort of job for him, because the real thing you sense here is the country's moving on.
And Stephen, you cover Venezuela, you also cover Cuba and much of South America. Which other countries right now should be worried?
Well, I think the one that looks next on the list, so to speak, is Cuba. The countries that perhaps have less to worry about, and that might include Venezuela, are the ones that are not so democratic. The evidence here really is that is not the main priority. The priority is, for the US administration, is it wants these countries to be pretty much on the side of the United States. What they do domestically, as long as they're not sort of in decline, is less of a worry. One of the things you notice about this and you hear from people is a lot of people object to the idea of a foreign country coming and snatching a president, whatever you even think about the president. But even they sort of concede that Trump's sort of odd way of doing things can unblock situations that seemed stuck for decades. There were a lot of people in Venezuela that thought probably the Maduro regime will be in power for perhaps decades. It could be a repeat of a Cuba situation. Suddenly, because of this move, the whole dynamics has changed, and who knows what this country will be like in 5 years.
That was Stephen Gibbs, who covers Latin America and the Caribbean for The Times and The Sunday Times. The producer today was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Tim Walklate. And sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have any questions about this or any other episode, drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow.